so this session we are dealing with seams. So other ways to deal with suppression, or in other words, other ways to deal with shaping in a bodice. We're not going to have time to cover tucks. I will do a film at some point and pop that up for you to see, but we won't be covering it in class. What we're going to look at today is princess lines. So princess lines are seams that run, and let's do a few little drawings actually, because they're running. So a princess line is a seam that runs down the whole bodice in various ways. So it will run, say, from the shoulder down over the bust into the waist. It creates a very nice fit. It allows you to use different fabrics if you like, different prints, different colours. There's lots of ways you can use a princess line in a way that's interesting. This princess line is probably the least interesting of princess lines. So we'll look at that one and then we'll look at some others. So let's say we have a princess line, could run from the armhole down through the bust, down through the bust line and out through the bottom. So you're still getting the same fit of bodice, quite a nice close fit, but you're getting that fit with a seam and not with a dart. And in the ones that we're going to do, because we're doing the simplest sorts really, is they're all going to run through the bust point. I might throw another one in there that's a little bit more interesting maybe. So let's also look at one that will come from the armhole and run out through here, so it'll come from the armhole through the bust point and it will create a shape like that. That is still essentially a princess line, so a seam that runs from the top area, the upper area of the bodice, and comes out through the waist. It can of course continue on with a dress. So also when we're talking about princess lines, we will be talking about whole patterns, about annotating your patterns and putting seam allowances on, grain lines on. So there's a couple of things extra that I want you to look out for at the very beginning of this process. I'm just going to number these so that we can work through them one at a time. Okay, so I'm going to start off by just tracing the block as it stands. There are wall charts for these that will be up in the studio from Monday and that I will post on in units, also ready for the class on Monday, should you be unable to attend. Oh, how do I do that? Okay. Remembering you're using a lovely fine pencil. Oh, sorry, I'm going back into position because something I want you to mark on this, very importantly, is going to be the bust line. And the bust line is going to help us in sorting out where our grain line needs to go once we've split the pattern. All of the dart manipulations that we've done, even the much more complex ones, would give us one pattern piece for the front of the bodice. This is going to give us two pattern pieces for the front of the bodice. Hence us doing seam allowances at this juncture. Okay, so for this one, this is creating drawing one. There is nothing easier, I believe. What we're going to do is we're going to come down from the end of our dart through to the end of that dart, and we're going to smooth off this line, and that is pretty much the job done. But we now have to split this into two pattern pieces, and when we split it or trace it off, this, what was the dart, will no longer exist. We won't be tracing that bit off. That's nothing. So let's get some paper and trace this off. Now the pattern piece for the front is going to need to be on a fold. One of the things you need to get used to is the idea that you will never make a pattern that with the instruction cut on the fold. You are always going to make a whole pattern. That's the way it's done in industry. If you're cutting out multiples, it's impossible to cut on the fold. Just thought something I've forgotten. Bad me. Pattern master. We're going to need balance marks. Now balance marks or notches are what we use when we're sewing an item together to make sure that it's going to go back together easily the way we want it to. So we can have one at the bust line, we already have it. If we mark off down the middle of the dart that won't exist in a moment, at a right angle from there we can give ourselves a balance mark. So I've put the 90-degree line on my pattern master against the centre line of the dart, and I can mark on either side and know that those are at the same distance from the end. If I want to check, I can then measure it. Now this is when you really do want to be using a fine pencil. Using a fat pen, you can end up being quite a few millimetres or half centimetres out when you're measuring up your lines. So a nice H pencil is what we're looking for. I'm just going to do the same here. I'm giving myself a balance mark about halfway down. Where they go is relatively random. They just need to be spaced in a way that makes it easy for you putting the garment together. Okay, so I have my balance marks on. Don't forget. And now I'm going to be folding that, so I'm going to give myself a bit of room. And I'm going to trace off this pattern. You will be doing it much more carefully than me. When you get to the bust area, please keep in mind what a bust is like. So it's a smooth curve. This should not be sharply angled when we come to the bust. So this is my centre front. I am going to, actually it doesn't matter if I haven't marked bust line on this. This is my centre front. I haven't drawn a seam down the middle of it on the design. So this pattern is going to be made whole. So I'm going to fold down this line. Ready for us to put our seams on in a moment. Now I need to trace off this section. So please keep remembering that we're tracing off, not tracing the dart. The dart no longer exists as a part of this pattern. Oh, do you know, I traced it off and I forgot to put the balance mark on. What sort of mad woman am I? Okay, so this one I'm remembering to put the balance marks on. I'm going to have to line up that first tracing to make sure I've got them in place. I think it's our next session maybe we start talking about, was it next session or next in a week, we start talking about facings and sleeves. So you will need these armhole notches. On this piece I need to put my bust line in, and the reason I need to put it in is to drawing the grain line. Okay, so those are our two pieces. Let me get my balance marks marked on here. So there we go. If you imagine we were sewing this together, and I lay those together, my notches are together, I can then kind of walk the seams round and my notches match. And they match, and it matches on the bottom edge. So you always want to check that your seams are going to go together right. Grain lines. Grain lines are what we use to make sure that we're using the fabric in the way that it needs to be used. We have our fabric laid out. That's the cut end. That's the cut end. This is called the selvage, and that's the firm edge. So this long grain, if you like, it's the warp grain. It's the one that's on the loom, and the weft runs across or runs right to left if you want something to remember it by. It can be slightly less firm than the warp. So when we put a straight grain on something, we're saying that we want that to run with the selvage. And we want it to be running as if it was running from straight down through the centre of your body. To work this out, it's easy with the front because very often your straight grain will run with the centre front. So I just need to draw a line on, parallel to my centre front. If you put an arrow at the other end, everyone will understand that's the grain. Or you can write on it, grain. So this is the centre front piece. We have our grain on it. We are now going to annotate it. So we are going to say that it's the centre front. We've got that, so we can just write front. It's the front of a bodice. It's princess line 1. And you need to tell whoever's dealing with this how many of them they need. So we are going to say of this one that we need to cut 1 because it will eventually be opened out and we will cut just the 1. So let's get this next one piece. There, can you see when the pieces are together? You can see where the darts would have been, but we don't have to have them because we're having seam lines instead. Now, working out where grain lines are, if the pattern piece doesn't have the centre front on it, you can use other lines that are considered to run with the ground. So we consider them horizontals, and the bust line is considered horizontal. So if we want something that's running at a right angle to the floor and the bust line is running parallel with it as a horizontal, to find the straight grain, we need to use our 90-degree line again, line it up with the bust line, draw a line in, that will be our straight grain. So, grain. So what is this pattern piece? This pattern piece is the side front. Oh, I haven't put size on here. Mine's a 10. Okay, so side front, princess line 1. Side front bodice. It's a size 10. For this one, we obviously need one that sits here and one that sits on the other side. So the instruction for this is cut 1 pair. It needs to be a pair because we need a right and a left. So that is pretty much fully annotated, and now we're going to add seam allowance. So seam allowance is that extra bit that you get to enable you to sew a garment together. The lines that we have on the block they are net. They are exactly where the garment is. So we need extra to be able to sew it together, and that's the seam allowance. Seam allowances vary. People use 1.5, 1.5, sometimes in curved areas. The important thing to remember is whatever your seam allowance choice is, it has to be the same for the piece of pattern that's going to be sewn to it. So there are exceptions to that, but don't worry about that at the minute. I'm just going to pop a centimetre all the way around. So I'm laying my centimetre line, which is this one, on my pattern master, and I'm drawing that in, and I'm doing that down. Now you will have to keep repositioning where that centimetre is, because your pattern's not made up of straight edges. So if it's a curve, you'll either find a bit of curve or you will just keep moving it, moving around. So here we go. I can do it this way and join them up, or I could find a piece of curve. Oh, that's a lovely match actually, but it's only a lovely match to there, and then I would have to move it to continue the match. So that's my seam allowance on around the neckline. And then we're going to do the same with this piece. So it's centimetre, then as I come around this corner, well, it's not a corner, is it? It's a curve. I need to keep moving and keep moving to give myself an accurate centimetre around the curve. Again, or you can find a piece of curve that's a really good match. But again, with curve, that's a good match to there, and then I have to move it. So you want to keep moving it until your seam allowances are super gorgeous and even and as accurate as you can be. Again, using a felt tip like I am so that you can see what I'm doing would make for a fairly inaccurate pattern. So what we've been doing so far with manipulating darts, it's part of the pattern making process, but you haven't produced something that could be called a pattern because you haven't produced something that's annotated and with seam allowances and with notches. It may well be at this stage that you start to miss some of the materials and equipment if you haven't bought everything. So to complete the pattern, I need to cut around this edge. I find cutting really relaxing. Quite like getting all my patterns done and sitting down with a movie on to do my cutting out. Might not sound very professional, but it's works for me. One piece cut around, a bits of paper out of the way. You might want to pin these two sheets together as you cut to make sure they're accurate, seeing as I'm just showing you how it goes. It's not massive. I think I can do an okay job. You need to make sure yours is super beautiful. Oh look, I can see where I wasn't quite accurate there. Okay, I'm cutting around the neckline. A lot of people use 0.5 in industry. You'd usually use 0.5 on a neckline. If you've got a centimetre, you'll need to cut it away when you sew. If you have 0.5, you don't. Notches. I hope you all have notches. Now we're going in, notching where our balance marks are. Now you could also notch on the seam allowances. We haven't used these ones yet, but they'll be used when we start talking about the sleeves. Now on this one that's cut a pair, those notches aren't necessarily that vital, but when we get onto the front, which is going to open out, get rid of that underneath. I think it's, there we go, that's clearer, isn't it? This half doesn't have any indication of seam allowances or anything, so if when we have it double, we notch through both sheets, it means that all the important annotations, or markings should we say, will occur on both sides of the pattern. Again, we haven't talked about backs of patterns yet. I will make a film of that. I don't think we'll have time in class, but there's one pattern piece, there's the other pattern piece. That is princess line number 1 done.